in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Russians, they were flying aircraft full of Russian troops to Cuba, and they were all in Prestwick, when the Americans were flying aircraft in full of American submariners going to the Holy Loch to get in their boat to chug off and, menace the Russians, etc.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app or join our emailing list at coldwarconversations.com.
David Mackay is a former Cold War Special Forces officer and is the author of Bubbleheads, Seals and Wizards, America's Scottish Bastion in the Cold War. His book shines a bright light on the significant role the Scottish bases played in supporting the US military over more than 3 decades. David brings his personal expertise into play, examining this intriguing story by reaching out to more than 100 veterans and expert witnesses. Their contributions reveal the personal stories of history and not the high-end diplomacy. We also delve into the espionage efforts mounted by the KGB against these bases through trawlers and agents on the ground. Among the many stories that David details are the nuclear missile submarine operations from Holy Loch, the large radio spy stations, and he reveals for the first time one of America's most bizarre intelligence gathering activities of the early Cold War. I'm delighted to welcome David Mackay to our Cold War conversation.
Obviously, I'm a Scot. I spent an awful lot of my life not living in Scotland, being an officer in the Parachute Regiment. And during my service, particularly when I had 2 years in Edinburgh with one para as a company commander, and we spent an awful lot of that time in Northern Ireland, but the rest of it we spent on what was termed in those days home defence. In other words, we were to defend Scotland against invading Red Army. So I got around quite a lot. I'm also a very keen mountaineer, and I was a scout leader and all that. So roaming around the hills, everywhere around the country, you start to notice things. So eventually I left the army when I was 40. I said, I've had enough. And I decided to do a degree at the University of Glasgow. They said they would take me on as a tutor on Cold War history if I got myself a history degree. I was directed to study this topic by one of the professors. He said, it has never been done. And I said, you must be joking. He said, no, it's never been done. No one's ever done it. So I ploughed on, dug into the information, got my degree, and a few years ago I thought I would turn it into a PhD. That didn't really work out, nothing to do with my brain, just it's to do with the university, not Glasgow, it was Stirling by that stage, being able to support me. But I had great support from various academics, some serious ones. Richard Aldridge, chap who wrote The History of GCHQ, he's a very close confidant. And I had some senior people in intelligence who were old cronies of mine. So I thought I would write the book. I got a very nice publisher up in Dunbeth, which is north of Inverness. And he said, well, this is a very good topic. And I said, yeah, well, fair enough. But I just wanted to tell this story because without putting a spin on it, history is written by the winners. We all know that quote. What it actually means is there is no financing for historical topics that governments don't think are important. So stories get lost. I was determined this one wouldn't get lost because I'm a West of Scotland chap, a Glasgow chap. Was very big when I was a young lad, submarines, nuclear submarines. And you would see the particular long memory was Glasgow Central Station. We'd be coming back from a scout camp or a scout event, and we'd be going through Central Station to get the train. And we'd see the American Navy shore patrol there. I always remember these big blokes, and they had big white batons at the side, and we were wearing white gloves. And they were obviously looking for badly behaved sailors to dragged them away. But that's just normal, you know. I suppose 20 years earlier, it was the Royal Navy looking for badly behaved British sailors. So those were memories, and I got niggled about it. I said, "This is a blooming good story." And this, I wouldn't say it became an obsession, but it became a bit of determination. I mean, my other determination, I'm determined to see my football team, Partick Thistle, get to the Scottish Cup final. So that looks as though it's not going to happen, but this one did.
Excellent. So with the story of the US in Scotland, they left Scotland after the end of World War II, but then they feel there's a need to return during the Cold War. Why did the US initially need bases in Scotland during the Cold War?
So the Americans realised by 50, 52, 53 that it was going to be different. And first and foremost, the best way to help Europe was to be over there. Then you had nuclear technology coming in. So what actually happened was the Americans said, chiefs of staff said, right, we want to get a lot of those bases we had in Britain for our bomber fleets. That's why they have those East of England bases, Mildenhall and what all that round that sort of Norfolk, Essex type of area. And because they had been using Holy Loch and Loch Long and all round here during the war, they knew fine well that this was an excellent place to operate submarines from. It then became more technical, more involved as the submarines got developed. But it was basically, we can have a forward base. Now remember one thing. What a forward base means is that the forward base is going to be attacked by the baddies. So the American homeland, they had time to get ready, And that's the point I keep making to people. And all my American cronies, they all burst into laughter. I say that's why forward bases are a superb strategic concept, but they get attacked first. So it gives you time to decide what you're going to do at the other end. And they then came from through the 50s. There was a lot of pressure. Even after Suez, when Eisenhower, quite rightly, had thrown a complete wobbler at the British and French governments for what they did, trying to recapture the Suez Canal. But that didn't get in the way. And the Americans had actually been in Scotland on one of these bases from 1952. And that was at Kirknewton, the first sort of radio spy base. And it was basically looking northwards, North Atlantic, the northern seas, to pick up the Russian vessels that were around there. So overall, it was a strategic shift. Boom. Because the Americans don't want America to be invaded, because we, the Brits, are the only ones that have ever done it, and pushing the boundaries out means they've got to get across your boundary.
One of the stories you start with, and there's so many great stories in this book, but I love the story of Project Genetrix, I presume it's pronounced, because it's typical of sort of like these early Cold War crazy ideas.
Well, that was something which I thought was anything between bizarre, ludicrous, totally bonkers. However, it was the technology of the time. There wasn't, enough mapping of Russia and the Chinese landmass. The Americans didn't have that. And they knew they needed it. Strategically, they had to have it. So how could they get it? Flying what are known as ferret flights, that's cheeky aircraft flying over, taking photographs and zooming back. That was always going on, but it was always going on around the edges. It was up the Baltic, round that way, and suppose on the other side, sort of the far east side of Russia and China. So the Americans decided that balloons would do that, because there had been a lot of balloon technology during World War II. Most of it utterly bonkers, didn't work. Some of it did. And they thought, well, we've put cameras in this and fly them over, and the wind currents will take them out to the Sea of Japan, and then we can capture it and take it home. Initially, they had thought about putting nuclear weapons aboard them, but they soon decided not to do that. So they went forward with this, and this was a very interesting thing. They're bearing in mind the military activities don't happen in a vacuum. You have interest groups, like so the Air Force. We want to be the big boys. We want lots of money spent on us. So they were pushing this. They did lots of trials, and they even came and looked at various places in Scotland. And one of the places they did look at was Edzell, which they used later on for a spy station. But from Edzell, they fired off a few trial balloons, which never went anywhere. They just drifted away south and ended up, I suppose, near Denmark. So it didn't work from there. They said, no, we're going to go further north to get in the jet stream properly. So they came across 1955, pretended that they were doing weather reconnaissance. And the main point about researching this is there's no memory of it locally. I mean, I did a tremendous amount of local research, and I got a great amount of help from radio stations, online, the newspapers, everything, local historians. And eventually we dug out a couple of 5 or 6 elderly lads who'd been at primary school at the time, and they could remember bits of it. So we could put it together. But the whole project, there was a bigger one. Stuff was launched also from Norway and from Germany. And these balloons went way up in the air, and then they started heading east, and then they were set up so they had timers that would switch on the cameras and timers that would switch everything off, and then they would drift out into the Sea of Japan, where the United States Air Force was waiting with cunningly equipped aircraft to do the hooking of the parachute when the balloon dispensed with its canopy, and the gondola fell to the ground with a little parachute on it. So the Edzell balloons, they launched 104 balloons, and one of them, whom I nicknamed Braveheart, made it. So, and we can laugh our head off. Gosh, that's terrible. The other sites were getting about 15% of their balloons got through, but this one balloon and the camera footage, it was absolutely superb. Gave them amazing footage of this, that, and the other. But as I said at the start of this explanation, that was top technology in those days. Nowadays, it seems completely bonkers, but it wasn't, It also upset the Russians, But it only took them about 2 or 3 days to figure out what to do about it. And their aircraft were able to get them in the evenings. Because it was colder, the balloons would sink to the ground because their canopy would come in, and they'd be able to get close to them and shoot them down. But the most bonkers bit of it was they carried a piece of metal, I don't know what it was for. I'm not technical enough. But this thing acted as a radar reflector. So the Russians could always see this on their radar screens. I wonder what this is coming towards them. So they always had fair warning, as opposed to someone spotting this balloon from somewhere. They actually had it on the radar screens. But overall, it was something that Eisenhower, I think one would say, gave the elbow to it. I think it ran for about 3 weeks, and then he said, that's enough, not doing it, no. They got benefit from it. And the Scottish ones, we got one over and it worked.
I think one of the things they had on it is that if it came down somewhere, it had in Russian, English, and possibly another language, sort of please return this to this post box in the US or something like that. Yeah.
Well, this is the human touch. This is the human touch. We think we're all gentle and consensus people nowadays, but we were so in those days. It basically said, don't worry, if you find this, take it to the American embassy and they'll give you money. So I don't know if that actually happened or if everything was, I dare say in Russia, it would be quite hard because it's an enormous country, and going to the American embassy carrying something is not what you would do. But maybe it happened in places like Switzerland and Norway or wherever. But there's no record,
And I guess this is not hugely different to those Chinese balloons that the US, a year or so back.
Well, I just burst into tears of delight when that happened. I said, this is just the same thing. It's just all the same nonsense. The nonsense is always, like everything else, it's not like the military are useless at cover stories. They don't make them up. It's the CIA who make up the cover stories. It's the same with everyone. Politics or whatever, film stars or royal families come out with the cover story. It doesn't work. And the cover stories for the Chinese balloons were complete nonsense. Of course they were up there with the cameras. Oh, that's why they were there. So that maybe gave the Americans some signal that the Chinese satellite system doesn't work so well, so they're sending balloons up to do it. Or was it, were they doing that to sow confusion? All of this goes on.
Maybe the Chinese read your book and thought, oh, that might be a good idea.
Well, as long as they buy it in vast numbers. I spent a long time in Glasgow University Library, and there's thousands of Chinese students there, so maybe they've all been told to buy this.
Maybe. So we mentioned earlier about the US wanting a submarine base, and the submarine base is at Holy Loch for ballistic missile submarines, but there's quite a lot of resistance around that. Harold Macmillan, who's the Prime Minister, isn't too keen on this base. I just wonder whether he was worried it would affect his grouse shooting or something like that.
No, the reality is Eisenhower knew this area. The final write-off for the D-Day invasion took place outside Largs in a hotel there. Nowadays it's called Manor Park. I don't know what it was called then. It's a big country house. So he knew this area. He'd been up here and he visited the Americans, and they thought, that's a good place. Anyway, so he eventually, as president, was told by his naval people, that's the best place for it. Macmillan had offered, from a political point of view, we could go up to Fort William and you'd still be able to get out, because you wouldn't, as one would say, hack off 2.5 million people, most of whom have votes. You can go up to Fort William, which currently has 12,000 people in it. So, and that'd be all right. The Americans said, no way, it has to be near main centres of population. We can fly in and out, and there's technological backup, and we have to get all of that. So that was agreed. Various things, the Nassau Agreement and various other accords. The main reason it was agreed was nothing to do with Holy Loch. It was so Britain could get into the American nuclear program, which we'd been shut out from by the McMahon Act, which was a sort of late 40s. Even though we'd helped, as you know, if you've seen Oppenheimer, we'd helped him to build this bomb. So that got us back in. There was some opposition to it, not from the locals. No. All those folk that came from somewhere, they weren't local. And there was a couple of big demos, then smaller ones, then even now, every day when we drive, I actually live just across the loch from Holy Loch. I can see it. Look to my right now, see it out the window over there. So when I drive past Faz Lane, and there are the band of bombers, they're still there, but they've been there for over 60 years and haven't achieved anything other than becoming famous for being there. So that was in reality what happened with the, we don't want this, ban the bomb. They all came up and it was famous for being a big demonstration. the local authorities, all the way down from Clydebank, and I suppose, down the Argyll side, down to Girvan, probably, they all were Labour controlled. And apart from two of them, they all said, we want this because it will bring people in, it will bring money in, our economy will grow, and we're all Labour controlled. The other point was, when this was decided, it was decided after the 1955 general election in the UK, and the Conservatives took almost all the seats in Scotland. So they had, if you want to talk about mandates, they had a mandate. They had loads of, they had far and away the majority vote in Scotland, etc. So, yes, there were these very colourful demos and famous people at them. But in the end, the locals just got on with it. There was no stuff. You would have the normal sailors fighting at the weekend. Oh, jings, that's an amazing one, They're still doing it in Helensburgh from the base at Fastline. And they still do it everywhere. It's not because they're sailors, it's because they're young lads, and that's what they do. Because you and I were both young, and we were either in scrapes or we managed to body swerve them.
I think one of the lovely little details you got in here is one of these ban the bomb protesters later became a NATO Secretary General.
Well, that's one of the funnies of all. George Robertson, his dad was the police inspector in Dunoon. So he was supposed to be at Dunoon Academy. Very, very old school. Back to, I don't know, sort of 1600s or whatever when it was started. And there's another guy called Brian Wilson, and he became a Labour Party cabinet member at the same time. I'm still in contact with Brian Wilson. He's very helpful on it. But they were there at the front shouting, go away, ban the bomb, we don't want you. And Brian Wilson has some good input in the book about what it was like, particularly at the time of the Cuban crisis. So these guys ended up on the other side, dealing with the reality. I thought Robertson in particular said, so he went from truant schoolboy on a demo to Secretary General of NATO. Well, it's amazing how well you can do.
Indeed. And the book is sort of peppered with various oral histories that you've managed to pick up as well, which I found particularly interesting because that just brings it a lot more alive. It could be just statistics and numbers and stuff like that, but you've got a lot of personal stories in here.
I set out to tell this as a story. I said, this is a story. I'm not writing a dull academic tract. And what I did find out, and this may well be disputed by my academic acquaintances, but they're quite happy with bits of paper. They can't handle people. And that's the whole reason why they make a big fuss about oral history. I had to go on a 2-day course to learn how to interview people, fill out pieces of paper. Anyway, I went online and managed to dig all these people out of all these old comrades' sites and have a good blether with them. And you get all of the background because it's their story. I was a Cold War warrior. We didn't do well in the Cold War because we had some very clever politicians. It was because we operated to high standards and worked very hard in cold conditions and all of that everywhere we went. So that's a story that has to come through. It's the people on the ground who make the thing work, not the big people. A large, as Churchill said, invade Europe. Well, what a brilliant decision that was. It took about another 150,000 folk to sort out the plan and get it to work, and another 2 million to execute it. So that's all we get, and you get lots of input from these people. I tried to keep it specifically related to the job that they were doing here. But one or two of them, you have to allow for a bit of flavour. People go into a pub and what's happening. And some of the pub stories, they get people come over and say, "Oh, we know what you're up to," we what I call fairy tales. And they make up fairy tales and they bounce them off the guys who've got to stand there and take it and think, pardon, what do I say here? So, but that was to give the reality of folk in the country would come out with these fairy tales, because some of the Americans have recounted them. That therefore mean that the locals were believing these fairy tales, because that chap didn't just have this fairy tale and he hadn't told anyone else about it. Someone told that to him, and somebody told that to the first person, and so ever. Having lived through the time, I don't know if it was a great comfort, but I suppose it was subconsciously. These folk were here, and we had a big bomb, and that would sort the baddies out if they thought they were going to try anything. And that's, I would just get on with their lives. I was there when it happened. This is what happened. These people were there when it happened. And that is the problem we get. We go all the way back to academics and bits of paper. You don't get that from bits of paper. I used to read online here documents with 255 pages in it and got absolutely nothing from that was of any use. So that's the problem. That's all we've saved up all this information, and it's important. I said, but what were the people doing?
And that's exactly the reason why I started this podcast, is to capture these stories before we can't capture them, and actually hear from the people who were there. Because even if it is, captured as written, sometimes, it loses its flavour purely by being recorded as written. But you definitely capture the flavour in this, though, David. I'm not denigrating the book in any way there, but completely understand. Holy Loch is probably the most famous base that the US had in Scotland. Was there any worries about Spetsnaz or Spies operating near there?
Yes, and this is where I was assisted by a couple of old paratroopers. One who was one of the top men in the CIA, because he swapped careers when he became lieutenant colonel. Number 3 in the CIA, director of operations, and another one who was a diplomat, who joined the Foreign Office, became a diplomat. So he wouldn't even tell me how high he was in the diplomatic service. I said, but I believe you've got these very high awards, so you must have been up, Major General level. So he wouldn't tell me, even though he's been my pal. We did our parachute course together, God almighty. So these guys were able to tell me, this is actually what happens in situations like this. There's a requirement to find out knowledge, and it can be all mundane stuff, but when you keep looking at it, somebody in our system says, well, that's useful to me. The best story at the Holy Loch was the East German, the unfortunate East German who was set up by the KGB to run I suppose nowadays it might have been what does it call it, an Airbnb, but maybe it's a bit larger than that. And he was in there and he was trying to spy, and he managed to get a couple of Americans in on it and a local guy. Now, this local chap was a bookmaker who later on claimed, when they'd all been caught, that he actually worked for MI5, etc. So the charges against him were dropped. The Americans were jailed for 2 years or whatever. But the funny thing about it is, I mentioned this to a couple of Americans who'd been there at times, saying, oh yes, they were selling plumbing, the plumbing plans of submarines, ho. Well, that's very important. That's very important. That information, we can do something. We know, etc., where it comes from, or if they start producing more somewhere, we know that they're building more of these submarines or whatever. So it was the contrast between the fact that there was a lot of espionage and the fact the folk on the ground didn't really know, because by that stage, you don't know because you're obviously too young to know. But in 1961, Connery arrived And we all knew what spies were about from then on. And of course, people were looking for the James Bonds of the Russians, and it doesn't work like that. The Spetsnaz, they would come in on the back of being a lorry driver from Poland and have a good look round and they'd see various things, and they would meet the sleepers. These were we did the same. So the sleepers, I dare say, would be folk who were very deeply into the Communist Party and blah, blah, blah. And they might even well be Russian nationals or whatever. They'd be over here and they'd live here and they were going to be activated at a stage. So you would either read John le Carré or you could read Alan Judd. He's one of my pals, right? He's the guy, he's the diplomat. They tell you that these folk are there, and at a certain stage they get activated and they have to go and do something. So all of this was live. This was a reality. And something which Doug Wise spoke about, carrying out sabotage to prevent people getting into base. I had already encountered that when I did security for the Coolport base in its very early days. And I pointed out that you need high towers because we were able to sneak up to within 50 feet of the fence. And it's too late then because we'll get forward and we'll cut our way through and whatever. So they put up big high towers that gave them more to look. But doing that, because we parachuted in locally, trudged down and went round, and it was sort of the early days of spray paint. Because on trees, saying we've cut those trees down, we've blocked the roads. That's what Spetsnaz would be doing. They'd be dropping these trees across the roads, knowing that you couldn't get from point A to the base without climbing over all these blooming trees. It would take ages to get people in. They couldn't run vehicles up and down. You had to get tractors in to pull it away. So over the peace, the local people and the American military weren't highly aware of spying, espionage. They knew about security on the tasks that they were doing, but that was inside their own bubble. You know, you don't tell anyone about what you're doing or whatever. But the external one of other people trying to find out. There's a chap in the taxi. The taxi driver was getting too chummy with him and asking a lot of very detailed questions, so we got him to drop him off well short of his accommodation. And then he kept looking out for him every day after that, but he said, I never saw him again. He reported that into the naval security. So that was there all the time. It's a big military setup. Spetsnaz, of course, it would be great to see their maps and their contingency plans from the olden days. But
it would. I can't imagine we're going to see them anytime soon, though. They're probably revising them as we speak.
Yes, updating them, I think is the phrase you're looking for, I guess.
One thing I found particularly fascinating was Ullapool, because what I wasn't necessarily aware of is there was a large Soviet trawler fleet, an Eastern Bloc trawler fleet that used to regularly anchor there.
Yeah. Well, Ullapool is one of these places, I think you could call it hiding in plain sight. First of all, from my point of view, my aunt lived in Ullapool. So I knew of Ullapool. I'd been there. And I do remember she said, there's all these Russian trawl fishing boats. And I was too young to think my way through that. But it was basically the East Germans came along to do a bit of fishing. Well, we need more fish. Because they're all landlocked. You know, there's a thing we tend to forget. They're all landlocked. Yeah, they've got a wee bit of access to the sea, but they have to come out and do a real serious fishing in the Atlantic. And they found it comfortable up there, so they started bringing these odd-looking trawlers, which are festooned. What a beautiful word. They were festooned with radio antennae, all types. I was a signals officer of a parachute battalion, And we were in Berlin, West Berlin. So we used to do tours into, every 2 or 3 days we'd go in and snoop around in East Berlin. And look at them and measure the length of these antennae in a direction. And that was all passed on to through the intelligence system. So when I see any of these things, I say straight away, well, that's what I now would classify as a SIGINT, a signals intelligence. They're collecting an awful lot of radio traffic. And they actually had not just the trawlers, which would follow, in the main, they would be following the American boats and the UK boats that were coming out from the Clyde, trying to stay close to them and identify patterns of behaviour, all that type of stuff, intercept any communications. But they also brought what they call factory ships. And these were fully laid out, fully fitted out with all the signals kit to, hear and listen and save up the information. And in the back of all that, we were doing the same. We were going up around Murmansk. And the famous one, the Gaul, the fishing vessel, the Gaul, which went down, there were all types of parliamentary shouting and raging about it. But the reason that took so long for the story to come out and it was just sneaked out on a bad day for news, it was the fact it was a spy trawler. We did the same. And there was a couple of GCHQ guys were drowned in it, along with all the 20 or 30 guys on. So that's what we did. But Alapul, Russian, embedded itself with the locals, and the locals would invite them to ceilidhs and they'd see them in the pubs. But they pointed out they would always have at least 2 escorts with them. And saying somebody got to the toilet, he'd be escorted to the toilet to make sure he wasn't climbing out the window to run away. And it sounds hilarious, and it is, but that's what it was. And that went on for about, I think, 10 or 15 years. They even had football games and whatsoever. And, at Alapul Museum, which is a very tiny place about the size of a cowshed, and they have, quite a lot of the stuff is these are artifacts from those times, Russian badges, etc. And of course, all of these Russian boats, they had a couple of very well-spoken English-speaking officers on board. As I've said in the book, the complete profile of a KGB officer, and these guys were fluent in 3 or 4 languages. So it certainly was very serious. And there was no point in doing it any further south in Britain because there was no nuclear submarines leaving from there. It was only up in Scotland, and that's why this entire focus was up there.
You have a great story of the KGB taking pleasure trips on the Clyde.
Well, this is what happens if you talk to people you know and tell them what you're doing. Prior to living here on the side of the loch, we used to live on the Isle of Bute, which is about maybe 10 miles distance from here. So I'm speaking to this chap I knew down at the boatyard and saying, I'm doing this boat. And he said, oh, I've got a great story. And he told me the story. When he and his chums decided to have a day off school, so they'd be about 17, they'd be doing their hires, that's the same as A-levels, and they were finished, so just mucking about at school for a couple of weeks. And they would go on the Waverley, the famous Waverley paddle steamer, which is great, been on it quite a few times. And it would chug down the Clyde and go round, visit various places, then you'd all come back home. And then it chugged across Holy Loch just to do a little circuit in it. Couldn't go up the loch because of all the American boats that were there, but you could do a circuit at the bottom. He said, and as soon as we got there, these guys in big dark coats and hats rushed to the rail and pulled out cameras and started taking photographs. And they said, well, what's going on here? And they took lots and lots and lots and lots. And then that was it. And they said, and then once we got back to Glasgow, they bolted off the boat. They didn't come off the same as everyone else. They were at the front, and off they went. So I ran that one past my diplomat pal, and he said, oh yeah, that's very feasible. You know, even though they're not supposed to be there, they're not supposed to be within 30 miles of London, they could claim they were visiting some fishing delegation somewhere, which they're allowed to do. So these are all the bonkers stories that come out, but you only get them if you go and speak to people. You won't get them out of books.
Although you do get them in your book, obviously. I think with Holy Loch, there's also some submarine incidents near there with Soviet subs actually coming in really close inshore.
Well, this is very interesting because we tend to think of what we do, what's really exciting. We were up in Murmansk and round about there and sneaking around all these submarine bases in our submarine. You know, that was brilliant. The Russians were doing the exact same. Now, you think, now I don't know Murmansk, but I certainly know the Firth of Clyde. And the fact that this Russian submarine came up the channel, it would be the Firth of Clyde channel. There's various channels in the so it came up and it bumped into the American that it was trying to shadow. Now this is very close. This is maybe at the very northern end of the Isle of Arran. So it's about, from where I'm sitting, be about 20 miles down the loch. And from the shore, 3 miles, maybe 4 miles. So they bumped, it surfaced, the Americans came up as well. The Russians then submerged and shot off, you know, but they've said there was a big hole in it and whatever. And on the American one, they had the same problem. They managed to back up river. But there was also another one when it was identified it was a Soviet Victor-class submarine. Now, that carries nuclear weapons. And it was on the tail of a Royal Navy sub as when it had left. So eventually, the Royal Navy, they sent in another submarine to lure it away, and it managed that, you know, a very cat and mouse type, like the famous hunt for Red October. Boom, that type of stuff. And it managed to lure it away. Now that is, you know, absolutely what? You think that's all happening out there. Then there's an even more, well, I'd say pointed one. The Americans were doing their sneaking about in Murmansk. They got a serious casualty. Some guy, let's say, had a brain aneurysm, something terrible. And so they sent a signal out, look, we need to get him airlifted. And it was arranged that he come down through the Hebrides and off Mull. We'll do it off Mull. We'll get it there. Because this boat was on its way back to the States. But they declined. They said, no, we're not going to hand him over. We're going to get him transferred to an American vessel. The reason was because he was an NSA man, you know, he's obviously Civvy, National Security Agency, and they're the main players in all of this spying. They're the ones who do the radio spy station stuff. They do all of that. So they weren't going to hand him over to a British hospital or anything like that, but they'll put him on an American boat and get him taken back to the States. These are real things. You read about, we have these systems, you know, and we do these things. See, that's fair enough. But tell me a real story. So we got real stories, but by basically being nosy. People will say to folk like me, but how do you know that? How do you know so much? I say, because I talk to people and I listen to what they're saying. If you don't introduce yourself to someone, you don't know what they could tell you. And people in the main tend to keep the people they know. You know, so they've exhausted that source of stuff. I just go up to, there's a submarine museum in Helensburgh, And I talk to anybody that goes in, and they'll tell me stories. Lots of them. I mean, it's not that I'm not interested in them, I just tend to get no particular relevance, but they'll tell me stories. I explained who I am, what I'm trying to do, and they say, oh, well, I used to do this, and I remember we did that. So you build up, I think it's called background. They call it background in academic world. You don't quote them. I'll just say, I'll use you for background. You get the director of the CIA telling me something, but he doesn't want to be quoted. So you just put that in there as background. And that's how you build up the knowledge that there's lots of people with lots of completely bonkers stories. It's my sons say, Dad, once you start a story, it's not one story, it's 5 stories by the time you get to the end. A bit of the Billy Connolly, Sir Billy, Sir William, and I come from exactly the same place. He grew up in the next close to my grands, so I used to bump in. I bumped into when he did all these young days, and also I knew him through Parachute Regiment. But it's to do with the ability to listen and talk, and you'll then get people to tell you things. And you don't have to write them down because the stories are quite graphic and quite interesting, so you'll definitely remember them.
And you're telling some great stories here, David. So you mentioned some of the other sites so Holy Loch, as I said, was the main base there, but there were a number of signals intelligence sites.
Signals intelligence was the big player, and it still is. That's why we've got so many satellites up. They're all doing what used to be done by these ground stations. You can stick up huge big masts, and by having masts and antennae of different length, you're able to listen into different frequencies which have been broadcast. So Scotland was a big ear, because it was North Britain. It was near the zone which mattered, which is the North Sea and the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. That's where the Soviets had to bring their submarines through, or their aircraft through, to get down to USA or whatever. So they could listen to all of that. It started off at Camp Newton near Edinburgh. My story about this is a very sensible one. We parachuted onto there, and on the way down, I said, this looks like an old signals base, because I'd been a signals officer. I knew that those were old, masts, signals masts. So eventually I found out about it. The Americans came there in 1952, and they listened from there, and they did the normal. They brought in the NSA people, the GCHQ people, all types of military security services, and they listened in to this sort of north of Scotland in a big fan shape from left to right, and they've heard lots of interesting things. But after the Cuban crisis, they sat on top of what we refer to as the hotline, that famous thing where the American president picks up this red telephone and speaks to the Russian president. Well, it wasn't that. It was in those days, it was a sort of typewriter, a auto printer or whatever. But that's where it ran through, and it was there were guys there who had the security clearance to do various admin tasks on it, check messages every day, etc. So that was a very good base. We then had 1960. The 11th of February 1960. The reason I can remember that was my dad's birthday. But the Americans had taken ownership of an old RAF station at Edsall, and they hadn't told the Pentagon about it. They just sent them a signal saying, we're taking control of this, because one of the American senior officers in their embassy in London knew fine well that'd be a great place for a radio spy station. That then grew up into what was described by the chief of naval intelligence as the sort of the golden site in Europe, our main site in Europe. We'd trade all the other ones, but we wouldn't trade this one. This one's essential. And it listened to the Soviets. It pinpointed everything. It listened a lot to commercial traffic as well, because it's just part of diplomacy, the commercial traffic. All this, terrible listening to. You should only be listening to secret things. We listen to everything, and if that's part of it, it gets done. So all of these things were done from there. It ended up as part of the Apollo space mission. They had listening sites there. They had satellite tracking and downloading stations there. Huge site. And then we go, there was various other little places, but which sort of played a minor part. But then we went up to Thurso on the north coast of Scotland, right up on the very top. Thurso is just a few miles away from the Queen Mum's castle, so people might have an idea how far away that is. The castle at Crathis. But Thurso was a radio station. It was where they would communicate to all the American and NATO vessels in the area. They also did a lot of, along with EDSO, high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, which is shortened to HFDUF. So that basically finds who's transmitting. You would hear the traffic, you'd write all that down, and somebody else would hear it, and you'd coordinate the bearings, etc. So that's where they are, etc. So that's how it was done in those things. Nowadays, it's done from satellites and far more accurately, etc. But Thurso also had the most ominous thing. Forget about the Holy Loch. It just did what it was told. Thurso transmitted the message. So it had a 600-foot. Now, I'm looking across the loch. Can't see too much because it's raining, but I know on the other side of the loch, the hills are 600 foot tall. And this mast was taller than that. And it was plugged into the big American national system of the president saying, start World War III. And that's where it was transmitted from. The reason it had to be so tall is because the submarines couldn't come to the surface to get messages, because their whole concept was they were invisible. So once they started coming to the surface, they could be identified in various ways, too mundane to go through. So they had to keep very deep, and they have a big trailing wire antenna out the back end. And this would be about 2 kilometres long. Every time they dived, they'd chop it in two, because huge propellers, then they'd roll out another one the next time. So to get the signal down to that, you needed a very high mast. The mast had to be maintained by people who climbed up it. And there's some hilarious tales of these guys. And do you think, I mean, I've done a lot of mountaineering, a lot of serious stuff. And I said, but I wouldn't be doing it for my job, you know. Basically, with a molten bucket to rub the ice off, because if it's covered in ice, it's going to fall over. My dad told me that when I eventually got him to tell me about his Arctic convoy, and he said, well, we just spent all the time chipping the ice off the rigging. Well, Dad, why did you do that? He said, because if we didn't, the boat would roll over. So I knew that, you know. It was an early lesson in physics, I suppose. You know, what was, you know, too much weight at one side, it falls over. So these guys would go up and they'd chop it all away, and that's all right. The mast had originally been in Londonderry. And I'm calling it Londonderry because that's what it was called at the time. I'm not involved in any disputes. But the IRA had a go at the American base there. So the president himself, who was Gerald Ford, it actually went to him and he said, well, we've got to get it out of there. We can't afford, because we've got too many Irish voters that want to vote for us and we don't want to get involved. So it came out of, this whole operation came out of Londonderry and moved across to Thurso. And that stayed there, like everything else, up till mid-90s, when it was all moved away. They were the three main spy stations and radio stations.
I think with Thurso, that was the one where the US was supposed to notify the UN due to a treaty obligation, and they didn't.
Yeah, well, that was very naughty. You know, the basic point, that was in the times of when they were developing the SALT treaties. Now, that was long before Ronald Reagan appeared, but that was the concept, nuclear disarmament, and we must notify one another and all of that. Oh, yes, we'll do that. You know, ho, ho, ho. We'll sign these treaties. So if you did any of this stuff, you had to notify it to the UN. Of course, it's actually written in, well, I don't know if it's written in the treaty, but it's written in the preamble. Oh, by the way, don't tell the UN. You know, we keep quiet about this. Because they'd initially, the cover story there was this was part of the distant early warning system. Because it had been looked at as a probable site, but it would only give a marginal benefit. So they said, oh, we won't use it, but we'll use it for this, and we'll pretend it's part of that. Remember what I said about the CIA and the cover stories? They're all a load of tosh. But a cover story is given out and saying, well, you've heard what I said, nothing more.
Now, in addition to these signals intelligence sites, there's other sites. I think one of the ones I found particularly interesting was Machrihanish. Is that how it's pronounced?
Well done. Most people can't pronounce it. Machrihanish is a fabulous place. I used to have a house over there. Fabulous place, Kintyre. Mull of Kintyre. I had to organise a huge big parachute exercise, parachute brigade. It turned out to be the last exercise before the Falklands, but we didn't know that at the time. So I had to go down. I was the chief umpire, exercise director, blah, 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 and ground and clear it. And I had to go to a farm, North Park, and I had to speak to the chap who owned it, and that was Mr. McCartney. And he said, oh, great, oh, that'd be terrific, yeah, blah, blah. And you know, soldiers can run all over the land, etc. But the reason I'm telling the story is because it got me very familiar with the length of the runway. The longest runway in Europe, 10,000 feet or 12,000 feet, enormous, big, long runway. And there's a reason for it. It was to get all these heavily laden American nuclear bomber aircraft onto it when they flew across the Atlantic. So its specific role, it was that a transit point. It was far away. It's 150 miles away from Glasgow. And there's only two roads, one down the west of Kintyre, one down the east of Kintyre, so they can be easily observed. And it became a very interesting place. They ran an awful lot of intriguing stuff from there. The one that the most resonance with was the US Navy SEALs. They came along being similar mentally, afflicted people as paratroopers. They parachuted in and got on with being there for the next 10 years. Did all the training up and down the west coast of Scotland, all types of exciting things. And they were a deployable unit that would deploy immediately over to Norway. That was there straight away. So Norway was only maybe 4 hours flight from there. Whereas if they're in the States, about 12 hours to get across. They did a lot there. But the other interesting bit is Machrihanish was used as an airfield. The anti-submarine warfare aircraft used it. They would fly in there, fuel up, stay over there for a couple of days, because most of the anti-submarine warfare that was carried out was down the west of Scotland. And these submarines were identified and the locations were found by EDSO, with their kit. So they would fly aircraft out to it, it would follow them down and let them know that we were there. Occasionally they would physically drop hand grenades on them to try and get them to surface, or small explosives. I forget the name of the type of explosives they would use, but they would drop that. They would drop these buoys, sonar buoys, which would pick up which direction they had gone to very complicated. These aircraft would come over from the States. They'd have a 3-month stint in Scotland, mainly at Machrihanish, sometimes up at Buchan, and occasionally up in Shetland. So, in order to get a submarine, it was got nuclear weapons on it, and you decided, well, we have a saying in Scotland, it's called the game's a bogey. In other words, this is it. So we had nuclear weapons at Machrihanish, and they were looked after by US Navy mine men. And these nuclear torpedoes would come in by boat. They'd come into Loch Long, just up the road from me, be unloaded at Glenmalin, where we still load and unload at the moment. The aircraft carrier comes up here on a regular basis. And this stuff would be sorted out at Glen Douglas, which is beside Loch Lomond, big American store. It's still a UK military weapons store. And it would then be driven down to Machrihanish and stored there. These nuclear torpedoes would be put on board the aircraft. It was normally a P3 Orion because of its great. It can last 12 hours, tremendous endurance, etc. And they would just drop them, and these would fly off and scupper the baddies. So that was very, very interesting. The locals hadn't a clue. They hadn't a clue about the US SEALs being there, other than the fact that they would meet them in the town. They never saw what they were doing. Well, it's a very big area, and nobody lives there, so that's why it was chosen to do these things. So overall, it became a very important base. And as I said, to go back to my opening bit, we then parachuted in there at the start of this exercise, and that was another story. But as I said, I realised and I saw all these things, and I thought, wait a minute. And I sneaked about and asked questions. Oh, can't tell you. But I was told, and I could tell by looking at them, I said, that's a parachute stored there. That's for drying canopies. Oh, no, it's not. I said, yes, it is. I said, you'll have a rifle range inside it as well. Oh, no, we don't have anything like that. Of course you have. I said, well, we've got things like that. Look exactly the same. We built it for you to our design. So that's, people say, I never knew that. I've lived here all my days. I said, well, you have no reason why you should have known it.
These guys were using the fault and recovery system there as well.
Well, we all know, I think it was Thunderball, when James Bond whizzes up into the air from the dinghy. Well, that's true. That's true. So this basically was, people are down, wherever they are. It could be on the ground, but mainly it would be in the water. And the aircraft would drop a pallet of some sort. It would parachute down. They'd open it up and they'd have a rubber dinghy. This is the water, obviously. So it's in the water. They pull the dinghy out. It inflates itself. And they sit there so they can't drift off. And then there was a harness which they fitted around themselves. And the harness was attached to a balloon. And you then press another button and pull the lanyard, and whoosh, the balloon inflated, and it went up. And this aircraft would come flying along. So it basically, it was the size of a Skyvan, as we could see nowadays. And these big prongs sticking out the front of it. And as you see in a James Bond film, it catches the line, and that's it. And it then pulls the person out of the dinghy, and they whiz up on the end of this, and then they pull them in the back of the aircraft. And that was what they practiced with. They'd go up, further up. They wouldn't do it on Loch Lomond because that's not good enough, not a good enough area. They did it here because this is a very good area. Nobody could actually really see what was happening because there's not enough people. But the loch is long enough, and the hills at the far end are low enough to get out of all these piddly things that the flyers worry about. We just say, well, let's jump in and pull the handle back, and we'll all hold on. So that's what they were doing. They were doing these amazing things. I had an American Coast Guard pilot pal who flew out of Mobile, Alabama, and he asked me, did I want to do it? And I said, no, I don't want to do it. I said, I'll come in the aircraft and I'll jump into the water and I'll watch it happen. I said, I'm not doing it. Hey.
And Prestwick was used by the US Air Force, but it was also used by Soviet commercial aircraft as well.
Well, this is one of the funny stories. First of all, Prestwick Airport has a unique historical importance. It's the only place that Elvis ever was in the UK. So when he was a soldier, he flew into Prestwick, stayed there for a couple of hours, had a cup of tea, and flew out again. And there's 10 million photographs of that. And they have the Graceland calf there and big photographs of Elvis on the wall. Still there.
Brilliant.
It's good.
Brilliant.
And, you think, why not? Why not? But the Americans used it as, let's say, a hub. They would fly people in from the West Coast, get them off there, have a cup of tea, and then fly them off across to Germany or France or wherever they're going. Lots and lots and lots of people. There was loads of aircraft that would fly in and out and park there overnight because it was a transit centre. It's the best weather of any airfield in the UK. That's why it's so important. Yeah. Now, because of the weather, it's part of what's known, I think it's called the polar route. It's the route where you get from sort of Europe to America, North America. And you don't fly in a straight line. You fly in this curved line along this route because of the wind conditions, etc. And also, Prestwick is right on it because it has good weather. So you can stop there and refuel and then do the next leg. So you can do it from Russia. And the Russians were doing this in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were flying aircraft full of Russian troops to Cuba, and they were all in Prestwick. When the Americans were flying aircraft in full of American submariners going to the Holy Loch to get in their boat to chug off and, menace the Russians, etc. The Americans didn't like this. They told us to stop it. But being British, we decided, no, that's nothing wrong with it. There's money involved in it, so we are not going. And I can recall when the Russian Kosygin came in, and he went to a football game at Kilmarnock, and he went to Glasgow. I was in the crowd shouting, "Welcome to your number one target," And that was great. But the rest of the crowd, most of them, they were all comrades, all welcoming their leader. So it was a very important base. It was just like every other place. I keep saying this. The locals didn't know what was going on. They say, "Oh, aye, there was Americans here." Yeah, they did. Oh, Elvis was here, and they had a big headquarters building there. But that's all. There's no. I've one or two pals from down there, and they said, we used to go and look at the aeroplanes, but we didn't know anything. It was like when the Berlin airlift was being done, that was one of the main staging posts. It would have 50 aircraft on it every day, getting refueled and then about to fly off to drop this stuff over Berlin.
How involved were these bases in the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yes, that was something. I was vaguely aware of it, but once I had done my research, I became a bit, how on earth has this not been said before? Because everything you read about the Cuban Missile Crisis is all about the noble Kennedy and his devious brother and all these people and blah, blah, blah. I said it all happened because of what the guys did in Scotland. It all happened. Boom. All the intelligence was gathered, all of the fast work. Holy Loch wasn't a submarine base. It was a big dockyard, except it didn't build on the sides. They just put big boats in, which were big factories. And they trundled a 12-day refit into 12 hours. This is all you're getting. Zoom, zoom, then back out on patrol. So the whole thing was amazing. The people were all wailing when when the tender left. And the story of the tender, I'd heard the story of the tender through family because the father-in-law of one of my sons had been the Navy commander, sort of Western Approaches, something like that. I don't know if that's what it was called, but Northwestern Approaches. So he was in charge of all these, what were called Zulu moorings. That's for the dispersal of warships during a time of crisis. And he, his daughter remembered, he said, oh, there was this, apparently they couldn't get the boat into Tobermory. Well, I've been to Tobermory, it's a small place, and this boat was a very big boat. And the sea conditions were atrocious. And I've met a couple of the guys who are quoted in the book. And they said, I never went to sea after that. I couldn't stand it. It was horrendous. So all of this information has always been there. But when we go back to the very start, you asked me, why did I do this? Well, this lovely Professor Bernard Aspinall had said, it's never been done before. And it's as simple as that. And that's what I would imagine loads and loads of people who do research find out. They say, but it's all, you've actually got to go and look for it. It's not easy. It's not like click on here and it pops up in the full story. You have to go and find out. But I never gave up on it. I said, this is too good a story and there's too many real people in it. And the nicest thing that happened, there was an American lady, she's in the book, and she said, could I have a copy of the book and you sign it for me? I said, certainly, not a problem. She said, I'm so pleased that somebody has written something about our Navy. This lady was saying, I was in the Navy for 5 or 6 years in Scotland and somebody's writing about it and this is lovely. And that to me, I said, that's great.
Well, David, I mean, the more I've spoken to you, the more I think maybe I should have you back on to talk about your wider Cold War service.
I also served in Nigeria for 2 years. That was very interesting, very good amount of Cold Warring in there. I was detailed by the High Commissioner to liaise with these two Americans.
Brilliant.
And it was all good fun. And as I said, my two great pals, in fact, there was a third one. He left early. He was a very posh boy. His brother was in the Guards. And he joined the Home Office. And it was the MI5, probably. Because MI5 does the Home Office and Foreign Office does MI6. But here's the real personal story. I went down to meet him. I hadn't met for, call it, nearly 50 years. And we met up at the Reform Club.
As you do.
As Alan is a member of it. This is great in here, blah, blah, blah. So I can identify it on every film that comes along. See, that's Reform Club. I'm in there. Whereas Chatham House, they were a good laugh as well. I was a Chatham House member as well. But they had just too much academic stuff in it. It's about people telling you what they did or what they found out. It's not really about looking at bits of paper and saying, well, I learned this from looking at a piece of paper. I can't operate that way. No, I'd be delighted to come back and blether away. Absolutely scoundrel-type stories to tell.
This is what we like, David. This is exactly what we like. If you want to hear more of David's incredible stories of America's Scottish Bastion in the Cold War, his book is called Bubbleheads, Seals and Wizards, America's Scottish Bastion in the Cold War. It is published by Whittles Publishing. And there will be links in the episode notes so that you can purchase this. There is loads more in the book. We have only scratched the surface here.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.